epistemic justice in the face of coloniality. I will first introduce our speakers and then they will present, and we'll have ample time for questions and discussion, both from those of you on Zoom and for those of you with us today in person. Ronelle Carlson is a clinical psychologist and a professor of community psychology, has been in the Department of Educational Psychology, but soon will move back to the Department of Psychology at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. She holds a doctorate in psychology, and her research is centrally located in critical community psychology within educational context. Her work explores belonging in educational context and pedagogies that enhance social inclusion and transformative community engagement in higher education. Urmi Dutta is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Lowell in Massachusetts, except it's the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. And she's involved in a number of interdisciplinary programs: gender studies, peace and conflict studies, and global studies. She completed her PhD in community psychology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and is a feminist scholar activist with an interdisciplinary training. Her research focuses on everyday violence, both in its forms of direct, structural, and symbolic violence that become endemic to society and are no longer questioned by most people in most institutions. We're delighted to have them here together to share with us research that has overlapping and intersecting realities, and to engage with us in a conversation afterwards. Thank you both for being here.
Right. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for this generous invitation for us to present some of our work that intersects. In our presentation today, we focus on counter stories of people marginalized in global South communities through histories of colonization. We both engage with how in different contexts they re-narrate stories of belonging and citizenship, reflecting their desire and determination to be human. Certainly in their contemporary everyday experiences, Urmi speaks to the epistemic injustice through counter storytelling in Mia communities in Northeast India. And I speak to student understandings of belonging during the period of student protests at my university, while highlighting epistemic justice and injustice through overt and covert resistance. Right, so firstly, just a very brief definition of epistemic justice. Fricker distinguishes between two types of epistemic injustice and justice. She refers to testimonial justice as dominant forms of power denying the value of knowledge that oppressed groups bring, and in so doing, dehumanizing their humanity as knowers. Now, hermeneutic injustice refers to oppressed groups often not having the collective resources to understand their social experience. With hermeneutic injustice, it's often not that oppressed people do not understand their oppression. They do learn to navigate the world between private and public. They may be seething at insults of bosses, but may fear losing their jobs. So, for example, the Black consciousness movement in South Africa constructed an alternative hermeneutic interpretation, which carried great power for oppressed Black South Africans, challenging the idea that their experiences were rendered interpretively unintelligible, because that's the key, to themselves because of apartheid. Now, this stance was picked up again by students, especially during the period of protest that marked the years during data gathering. But before I get to that, I briefly want to just comment on the relationship between coloniality of knowledge, being, and epistemic justice. The relationship between, well, epistemic violence leads to epistemological erasure, i.e., it's important to also recognize that erasure of knowledge is not only about knowledge, because identities, symbols, and worlds of meaning reside in epistemologies. When we raise epistemologies, we do more than commit murder of knowledge, or as Dos Santos says, epistemicide. We negate the dignity of humans and perpetrate the dehumanization of oppressed people. Those who are not white, male, middle class, Christian, and heterosexual are positioned at a deficit in relation to the state and institutions, where institutions are microcosms of society. So as mentioned, there were two respective studies as follows, and I will speak to my study in Stellenbosch. Colonialism and education, if I think about South Africa, and therefore university education are intertwined. Our university model is based strongly on colonial and Eurocentric assumptions that permeate colonies and continents across the Americas, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Euro-American knowledges are today still regarded as universal and valorized, with the accompanying dismissal of local knowledges and the minimization of the importance of ecologies of knowledge, which in itself constitutes an epistemic injustice at structural level. This map just shows that in terms of the apartheid and colonial past, there were 36 universities racially segregated up until 1994, when the new democratic order was born. With the formulation of new policies governing university education, there are now 26 universities, of which 2 are newly created universities that did not exist during apartheid. There are approximately 1 million students across 9 provinces. This slide just really shows the inequality. In South Africa, it's the most unequal society in the world, where the poor are disproportionately back. These forms of housing depicted in the picture reflect the poor township on the left, and on the right, a wealthy suburb in Cape Town. And yes, that is one home on your right. It's not an apartment block. So, in the face of broader South African inequalities and community struggles for survival, universities came to a global focus during 2015 and to 2017. It started as protest against the presence of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes on the University of Cape Town campus. Or in other words, the issue of decolonization of universities was firmly placed on the map. This imperative focused on epistemic and material inequities that characterized university experiences for the majority of Black students. It's interesting that hermeneutic epistemic injustice has occurred since knowledge from below. In terms of knowledge from below, the problem about statues was not heard by the powerful in 2001 already. At Stellenbosch University, language remains a contentious issue. And this is really what Open Stellenbosch, the Open Stellenbosch movement revolved around, and then it spread to other issues. Stellenbosch University was historically aligned with the apartheid regime that insisted on introducing Afrikaans in schools. The 1976 widespread protests and riots and killing of school students by police erupted because of Black students' resistance to Afrikaans as a compulsory subject in schools. Most of the apartheid ministers were educated at Stellenbosch, but it also has a history of resistance since Stellenbosch to apartheid by a number of white Afrikaans-speaking intellectuals and ministers, religious ministers. Stellenbosch is also one of 2 university towns in South Africa, so the town and university are fluid. More recently, when the university celebrated its centenary, the president of the university apologized for its, that's in 2018, the university apologized for its complicity with its apartheid and the trauma that it caused. About 3 months ago, the Wilcox building, named after the supervisor of Verwoerd, was changed to the Kratoa building. Verwoerd was a scholar of applied psychology and sociology, and his thesis on separate development led to the policy implementation as apartheid. The psychology department, where I will move on the 1st of January is housed in that building. Krotoa was an indigenous woman who lived in the 1600s, and her name decorates the building now. So the dominant South African narratives, and in higher education too, that still persists, many of these narratives were called into question. The slides reflect just some of these dominant narratives. There's a complexity too, since at the same time as saying Black student protesters are lazy, other knowledges of the suffering of students, food insecurity, and homelessness and isolation, for example, came to the fore. This gave rise to numerous interventions that hold many challenges, but which I will not delve into now. The dominant narratives, though, are national narratives and talks about young people born post-1994 as born free from the cudgels of slavery and oppression of colonialism and apartheid. But another favorite dominant narrative is that middle-class Black students are not oppressed. It's so common to hear people, and particularly white people, saying it's class, not race, that is an issue in South Africa. So given the challenges in South African higher education and my psychosocial support of protesting students at my university during this period, I designed a study in which I interviewed 30 students, some of whom participated in the protests. I did in-depth individual interviews that lasted for about an hour, asking students, what does it mean to be a Stellenbosch University student? The study aimed to understand how students think about belonging and non-belonging and how they navigate the university and town. So I want to give you a flavor by looking very closely at one student's interview, and I named her Irua. Irua spoke to experiences of racism and resistance in terms of their social relationships in public space and in terms of friendships, but also talked about protest cultures and collaborations that speak to the integration of testimonial justice and hermeneutic justice. And given the time constraints, I'm speaking to one interview. She said, so when going to a restaurant, it's always things of, you know, someone else gets their food before you, and you don't want to overthink it because I ordered before him. Is it because they don't see me as a patron? You know, do they think I can't afford it? And is it because you're also aware of your physical presence, like not talking too loud with a group of friends? Yes, but I mean recently, like with people that I've been hanging out with, they'll go to Bohemia, which is a pub. And I remember the one time we just started singing struggle songs. I mean, we all got kicked out afterwards. But we were all just like, you know what, if Afrikaans white people can come here and they come here and sing loudly and that just seems as them having good fun, but the minute Black students start doing it, they are causing trouble. You need to be quiet, you know. So there's been a lot of reclaiming of space, I think, happening recently, especially with a lot of the younger students. And that's really nice to see. So she talks about cutting ties with particularly white friends. And she says, I think social media plays a big role in that. And you know what's being discussed, and someone will share an article. Someone that I went to high school with shares a racist article about how these protests that are happening are basically barbarians and savages. And so you stop and you think, should I comment? Should I hold the comment? No, I would rather unfriend them. It's easy and it's direct. It's just the thing of I can't tolerate those kinds of people in my space anymore, and I'm changing as a person. To be surrounded by the same conversation and having to defend myself all the time, it's draining. Then she talks about protest cultures. And this is the last example I'm going to give. I would say, I mean, it sounds very dramatic. If you're willing to sell your soul and get a degree, then all means come to Stellenbosch. I think it just depends on how comfortable the person is in their Blackness, or how comfortable they are with the person that they are. They won't be bothered by possible everyday experiences. She said, I wouldn't recommend them coming to Stellenbosch, but I know there's also a conversation. The more people come, the more it's on their own personal basis. And then I will just tell them to think, you know what? Things will become better. A lot of first years I've met are just so unbelievably more woke, quote unquote, she says. than I could ever have imagined. So with time, I definitely think that the students coming into the space will change it. And she talks about, in my final year for Open Stellenbosch, we had the Steve Biko Study Center, and we would have this thing called late night thoughts and late night talks. And ever so often, there would be a different topic on black hair, religion, relationships with your parents, what does it mean? And I think those were the kinds of conversations that, isn't normally given priority to the everyday life, especially in the university context. As a black person, you have to have that safe space to discuss things that aren't necessarily always having to justify, why you feel certain ways. I'm sick of justifying it. Everyone just accepting what they believing to be the norms and values is important for me. And I think it's that sense of always having to justify yourself because you must speak to another frame of reference all the time and justify your own experience. That is part of the epistemic injustice. And so I want to end with a question. Did student protests disrupt dominant narratives and effect a little more epistemic justice? I'd like to say yes. I think that the struggle for epistemic justice is an ongoing process, and we make small gains. In the case of South African universities, gains were made not because those in power wanted to hear, but because they had to hear. Thank you. Umi will now continue.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Ronel, so much for this really nuanced presentation around epistemic justice. I think what Ronel's presentation really highlights are how these questions of belonging, of citizenship, and really the question of being itself, that these are not these big abstract philosophical questions, but things that are made and remade in everyday struggle and resistance. Along similar lines, I'm going to take us to another part of the Global South, where people are contending with this experience of being the other at home, Mia people in Northeast India. And the sentiment is powerfully captured by Mia poet Rehna Sultana in this excerpt. I'm tired of introducing myself to you. I bear all your insults and still shout, Mother, I'm yours. Mia communities constitute the vast majority of people facing mass disenfranchisement, detention, and statelessness in the Northeast Indian state of Assam. Today, I will briefly speak to the ways in which Mia communities are resisting their persecution through epistemic justice. But first, a little bit about the context where the citizenship crisis is taking place in Northeast India. While a huge swath of the population was disenfranchised through what is called the National Register of Citizens, it is but one of many mechanisms through which Mia people are being targeted, the kinds of persecution and statelessness that they're experiencing. The NRC itself has colonial origins. It was established by the British colonial administration to, quote unquote, detect and deport so-called foreigners. Yet the question of who is a citizen and who is a foreigner or outsider is incredibly thorny. It's very malleable and contested in these colonial contexts. Mia people, for example, were brought to present-day Assam in Northeast India from what is the present-day Bangladesh in the early 19th century. And this was part of colonial population transfers or forced displacements, where entire populations would be displaced for various reasons, in this case, for their agricultural labor. And these forced displacements have taken place against a backdrop of shifting colonial cartographies, sort of mapping and remapping of colonized territories as part of British administration. And I have these set of images which capture some of these shifting cartographies. So you see here the shifting cartographies of Bengal during the colonial era and sort of the arbitrary nature of imposed borders, which is always a function of political expediency rather than having anything to do with people on the ground and their lived realities. So these shifting cartographies have constructed tiered structures of citizenship and belonging in the post-colonial period. It is these imbrications of coloniality and state violence that produce contested borders and produce detention centers to hold people who transgress these borders or transgress the idea of what it means to be a citizen, which itself is a moving target. In these cases, detention centers are not precursors to deportation. Rather, these spaces function as zones of non-existence, what Lisa Kutcher calls social death. Importantly, the state is not a monolithic entity. It works in conjunction with media, scholarly productions, popular discourse, and with the broader civil society to surveil citizenship and belonging, often through the use of dominant narratives that erase or denigrate Mia people's histories and identities. So narratives that position Mia people as the other, the foreigner, the outsider, migrant, illegal migrant, and so on. Against this colossal scale of state violence and dehumanization, Mia people have mobilized a powerful network of grassroots community workers who are engaged in consciousness raising, legal advocacy, community education, gender justice, and much more. Simultaneously, they're also mobilizing a movement for epistemic justice, challenging political, social, linguistic injustice, while also claiming their collective legacies from the realm of subhuman invisibility. Today, I'm presenting this work alongside and in solidarity with Mia grassroots activists, highlighting their struggles as well as their collective work towards epistemic justice. In particular, I would like to give a shout out to Mia scholar activists Abdul Kalam Azad and Shalim Hussain, who were my co-conspirators on a recently published paper on counter storytelling as epistemic justice, where I'm presenting from today. So very, very briefly about counter storytelling. Counter storytelling is a method of telling the stories of people whose histories and identities have been erased by epistemic violence. Counter storytelling in our praxis is informed by critical race theory and indigenous epistemologies, but as importantly by Mia onto epistemologies. Storytelling has always been integral to Mia culture. Counter storytelling in our work is about disrupting dominant narratives about Mia people that criminalize and dehumanize them. It is about revealing the assumptions and frameworks that undergird such narratives. At the same time, counter storytelling is also creative and generative. It is about creating and uplifting stories of Mia resilience, traditions of cultural survival, and community aspirations and desires. We created the Mia Community Research Collective as a way to advance epistemic justice, building an assemblage that honors Mia people's stories in their multiplicity and brings those into the public arena to be acknowledged and witnessed, sort of akin to what Ronel talked about in terms of addressing testimonial and hermeneutic injustice. A little bit about sharing something that founder and core member Abdul Kalam Azad from the Mia Community Research Collective talks about the place of this collective in epistemic justice. We may not be able to completely unshackle ourselves from epistemic marginalization today, but if we build a community research collective that empowers us to counter hegemonic narratives in 10 years or 20 years, or even within our lifetime, that would be enormously meaningful for our communities. For Mia people, counter storytelling is about reclaiming what Edward Said called the permission to narrate. And Mia poet Shalim Hussain explains why this is necessary. Quote, the dominant narratives, they're all encompassing. These narratives are very heavily weighted on one side. What I mean is, if we enter into conversation with such dominant groups, we have to concede to some of the myths. Only then a conversation is possible. Overall, the impression they are trying to create is this: whatever we say, It is either highly exaggerated or pure lies. How do we enter a conversation from that? It is almost impossible. There is no mutual respect. The dominant narrative is heavily tilted because for the longest time, they have been the creators of discourse. So as part of the persecution of Mia people, as well as a consequence of it, they have had little to no opportunities for discourse creation, whether it is in the realm of media, academic knowledge, public policy, or even popular discourse. And when Mia people do speak their truths, they face allegations of claiming false victimhood, exaggerating accounts of suffering, or causing communal disharmony. Notably, the backlash that Mia poets and other Mia scholars experience when they engage in epistemic justice certainly comes from the state. It also comes from mainstream media, but also from public intellectuals, including seemingly progressive left-leaning intellectuals who often weaponize liberal discourses to undermine Mia people's struggles. Against such pervasive epistemic violence, Mia people are using counter-storytelling to reclaim their histories and identities. They seek to transform the terms of the conversation, where they can claim a discursive space that is unapologetically rooted in their Mia identities. Toward this end, Abdul Kalam Azad and a number of Mia community workers have founded the School for Epistemic Justice, a virtual space for now for Mia youth to engage in critical conversations about history, identity, culture, resistance, and revival of Mia language. In the context of Mia people's struggles for citizenship and belonging, counter-storytelling is also about disrupting dominant narratives that relegate to the position of a perpetual other. They have done this through the creation of community media platforms such as Ango Khabar, or which translates into Our News. Ango Khabar uses digital storytelling to uplift Mia people's everyday struggles at the intersections of multiple crises, such as citizenship and climate change. Ango Khabar is also very quickly becoming a critical archive of Mia ancestral knowledges, traditions, and cultural practices. Wahida, a Mia community activist, shares what Ango Khabar means to her and to the community, to the larger community. When Ango Khabar started and I first heard about it, I was astounded. Ango Khabar? Seriously, Our News? I have witnessed the same reaction in so many people. The first reaction that Mia people have when they encounter Ango Khabar is this really our news? Are they going to tell our stories in our language? They feel good when they see these are our community stories. They can relate to those stories. Mia poetry, a genre of resistance poetry, is another form of counter-storytelling that unerases Mia identity and names the manifold violence and persecution against them. Mia poet and translator Shalim Hussain describes this epistemic function of Mia poetry as a roll call of the history of violence. For example, this excerpt from a poem by Mia poet Qazi Mir. That land is mine, I am not of that land. The land where my throat cracks with appeals and no one hears, where my blood flows cheap and no one pays, where they play politics with my son's coffin and cards with my daughter's honor. The land where I wander crazy, confused as a beast. That land is mine. I am not of that land. Mia poetry disrupts dehumanizing narratives of Mia people. As activist Abdul Kalam puts it, we take the rocks and stones flung at us, the swears, curses, slander, and transform those into love. This love is crucially expressed through complex stories about the relationship between people and place, relationships that are rooted in Mia onto-epistemic legacies that rehumanize and restory Mia people's being and belonging in the riverine islands of Northeast India. For example, this excerpt from a poem by Mia poet Shirad Khan. Just as the tongues of beasts and birds have no books, my language has no school. I draw a tune from my mother's mouth and sing Bhatyali. I match rhythm with rhythm, pain with pain, clasp the sounds of the land close to my heart, and speak the whispers of the sand. The language of earth is the same everywhere. Across these examples that I have presented today, I hope you were able to catch a little glimpse of the powerful movement for epistemic justice by Mia communities. There are many refusals and reclamations in the face of coloniality and state violence, and the significance of this work in disrupting the stories or the narratives that sustain or legitimize this kind of violence. I'm going to end here on the spirit of Shirad Khan's poem, and by raising a question that his poem compels us to contend with. What are radical possibilities of being, belonging, and citizenship outside of the framework of nation states and colonially configured borders? I'll end with this. Thank you all so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, both of you. Exceptionally provocative. I want to look in, oh, yeah, don't take that question down. Ronell, do you want to take a stab at the question that Ori ended with before we open it to others?
Look, I think nation states are artificial borders. I think citizenship and belonging are fluid, and they become reworked and revisited in our everyday lives. And so national borders are certainly policed, and certainly when one travels through airports, you can see that all the time. Who gets pulled out, who gets isolated as part of the dominant narratives. But I think the important thing about transnational and certainly national solidarities amongst people, especially marginalized people, are so important because that in fact transcends borders. And it certainly is, in fact, in major ways supported through, virtual means. In the same way that, COVID has taught us that there are many ways in which we can organize, many ways in which we can draw on the knowledges of colleagues who are separated by physical distance. I think those are the very kinds of opportunities and platforms that we have to redefine ways in which we can do and perform citizenship every day that don't necessarily become part of borders.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask to answer your
Here's another question. James, you want to introduce yourself before you ask the question?
Yeah, I'm James Moura. I'm the senior scholar here at the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Boston College, and I have been doing some activities at UMass Law with Professor Fuki Dutta. And thank you so much for your talk and for presenting, I think, your narratives and how it's important in this space like YouTube, like women of color here in this institution, bringing these thoughts and I think provocative questions and presenting great bridges with your communities in South Africa and India. Then I think it's an important space to highlight. And I was thinking about the process of how the Maya communities and the Black students in South Africa created this counter narrative. It's like if you think in factors that promote this process of resistance, that space to disrupt, to question these dominant narratives and try to create a new life, society, a new reality. Because I don't know if you perceive if these people that are part of your narratives here have lived different experiences that become more resistant, more critical, and these dominant narratives in your realities.
Thank you for that question, James. So if I got it correctly, you're asking sort of what are the ways in which these have become part of people's everyday realities and the shifts that might have happened. Yeah. So yes, so there's been a significant shift. So one is that, the term Mia, in Urdu, it means a gentleman. But in this particular context, Mia has become an ethno-racial slur. So it's used as a swear word. So what Mia poetry has done, and what Abdul Kalam was alluding to, that we take sort of these tones and swears and all of the things that are flung at us and change it into love. So what they have done is they have reclaimed Mia from sort of the dredges of those kinds of slander that it has always been associated with, and it has become a source of pride. The same is also true of Mia language, which is not in the state, it's not recognized as a language. Maximum, maybe it will be considered a dialect, but even then it is denigrated. In fact, in a recent conversation, some young people were sharing how their experiences have shifted, that, when they were in the city, they would not speak in Mia language because they felt that it made them stand out and people would immediately make assumptions about them. But as part of being like both as a function of Mia poetry, Angukhabur, but also like this, the School for Epistemic Justice and all of these spaces that they have created, they no longer feel that way. They no longer feel that they have to truncate these different parts of their identity in order to do that. Relatedly, and the way that these things function, now that they have sort of reclaimed Mia, the identity of Mia, there are other terms of endearment that they use, which are now becoming forms of slander. So another example is the term Geda or Gedi, which is sort of an endearment that you would use for a young child, sometimes for like a younger person. And now those have become slanders. So now there are youth collectives which are calling themselves Geda Gedi collectives, and doing, for example, there's one group who they use memes in order to kind of sort of as a way of using humor to resist these kinds of discourses. So you can clearly see that there is sort of this like this generative impact, that it is like so much more than what they started with. Like people are really picking up on the ways that they can engage in epistemic justice in their everyday practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a while back that Bell wrote about transformative counter stories.
Yeah.
And I think in many marginalized households, families, those counter stories are shared all the time, but they're shared within the confines of the private space of home. I think what student protests, and there was also a video that was produced called Luister, which means listen, that spoke to the experiences of Black students on that particular campus. And I recall the president of the university saying he sat down in his home with his partner and watched that video and could not believe that those were students at his university. And in terms of the struggles that they had, and I think what these stories do more than resist, they have the capacity, I don't say they always do, they have the capacity to evoke compassion and empathy, and in so doing to restore oppressed people's humanity. Because if we can't feel empathy and compassion for another human being, we dehumanize them. Not only because we don't know, but we've never taken the time to listen. So I think the narratives of the born free were particularly disrupted because it's true for some, but it's not true for all South African youth, particularly Black youth. And even in trying, so these were students who are a very privileged, supposedly, group of people in society who have access to post-school education. And even in their search for a better life, there were these really difficult circumstances that they have to get engaged with, which were based on institutional racism. It also clearly disrupted this example that I gave you. Was a very middle-class student. And so that mantra of it's race, not class, is a very, very important one to be disrupted. And I think it's like one has to, I said it earlier on, one has to inoculate almost and get boosters all the time in the same way that we get boosters for COVID. We have to inject these boosters into public discourse because it's not going to be shifted with one big event in significant ways. We make small gains, but there needs to be reminders and continuous work because narratives, dominant narratives, are very powerful and they need to be resisted and interrupted on a continuous basis. It cannot just be a once-off event.
So there are now two more questions. I'm going to put them both out given the time.
Yeah.
One comes from Dan Bell, and it's related to this conversation that you all have been having about counter stories. It asks how Mia people's counter stories are heard by people who have been historically indifferent to what they are up against. And the second one comes from Dan Canstrom, also for you, Urmi. And he says that he was moved by the presentation and would like to hear more, if possible, about how you would describe the differences between telling our news, which is obviously critically important and uncontroversial, versus the idea of quote unquote our truth, which is also critically important, but in some forms may seem to contradict important human rights, universal aspirations. How do we facilitate dialogue, and have there been any significant attempts to do so in India?
Thank you for both those questions. I'll just briefly respond to Deanne's question, how stories are heard by people who are historically indifferent, which is really important. In the local context, what this has meant has been a lot of backlash against people. So some of the examples that I gave were, Mia poets were criminalized. And it's not that they were writing Mia poetry for the first time, they have been doing it for a while. But when that happened in the broader context of the mass-scale disenfranchisement, it became a lot more political. There were criminal cases that were filed against them, a lot of hate speech. So in the local context, it is very complex.
Thank you both so very much. I think you both left us with extraordinarily challenging questions that interface with each other and also help us push to new ways of thinking about protest and for more creative ways of standing with people on the ground and accompanying their processes of resistance. So we deeply appreciate your both being here today, and thank all of our guests who have been online, and thank our guests who are here with us present.